So, with our previous discussion, we've been emphasizing how gender is something that we do. It's a particular behavior, and it's fundamental to any given culture, any given society, right? And it's societal norms, um, things that we take for granted as being real when in fact they're created or invented. And it's really learned through socialization from a very early age, as I emphasized earlier, right? Even before you're born, there's gendered ways of interacting with, the soon to be born infant, right? And then certainly once any person enters the world that they enter is informed by gendered norms, gendered behavior, gendered custom, and so forth. All right, so it's really this world, right, that we're inhabiting, right, from birth until death, that we see this constant repetition of such gendered behavior. And, these gendered roles, basically works to normalize them, to make them seem normal, as natural, something you don't even question. Just like you don't question certain things in the world, there's, let's say scientific laws like, the earth revolves around the sun, so forth. We tend not to question, let's say, the gender distinction between male and female because we take it for granted. Now, notice what I just said is gender, right? Male and female. Of course, let me emphasize again that there's a distinction in sex between male and female. That's beyond contention. But when we attach those behaviors to a particular, let's say biological group versus the other, XX versus XY, and we attach particular attributes or traits to those two groups, then that's when things become more seen as social invention or social creation. All right, now important term here that goes actually quite in depth in discussing how gender is something that we do is gender performativity. And the philosopher theorist who conceived of this is Judith Butler. And she's still around today in the academic world. I believe she's over at UC Berkeley. And basically she advanced this notion of performativity, right? There's the quote of hers: "Gender becomes real only to the extent that it is performed," unquote. So just like we thought about race being real, right, has a social reality. And if you recall, racial formation was a really good way of thinking about that, how it's always involved in this negotiation, contestation, until it's ultimately replaced with new categories or new racial formations. We see something kind of similar too, according to Judith Butler, with gender performativity, because when it becomes performed, it becomes real. Okay, now, as I mentioned earlier, this is a very complex concept, even though it may not seem that complex from the outset. Okay, let me give you some examples of why it's more complex than it may seem. Okay, the first thing is, don't think of performativity as just something, like an actor is performing a role. Okay, sure, there's that element, and in fact, sociology emphasizes a lot how, a lot of our interaction is with other people, right? The social world is really acting. We are actors on a stage, even though we might think we're just behaving normally. No, this goes to extent to which intersubjectivity and interaction is the way we think of ourselves in relation to other people. In any case, these sociologists talk about theatricality, how things are performed, right? Or not things are performed, people perform their identities on the stage of life, so to speak. I know that sounds kind of cheesy, but think of it that way. Now, gender performativity actually goes deeper because, according to Butler, it's not like an actor assuming a role and then performing that role. Okay, that's how you may think of it for those uninitiated to the notion of gender performativity. What Butler actually means, however, is that, sure, in the beginning, it's an actor performing a role, but the actor forgets that he or she is performing that role because that boundary between actor and role has dissolved. Okay, so that's shows how it becomes real and naturalized and normalized because we forget that we're assuming a role when it comes to gender behavior. All right. Another way that indicates how deep this concept is through a philosophical a view of language, okay, called performative sentences. Okay, now this is getting really abstract, but I thought I'd share this with you, just hopefully you can make connections here. Performative sentences, this is if I recall correctly, this is a distinction made by a philosopher named J.L. Austin a while back in the 20th century, who made a distinction between performative sentences versus constantive sentences. And a constantive sentence is basically something, it's something that's sort of descriptive, right? For example, the sun rises in east and will set at the west, right? Well, that's something that's just describing a state of affairs in the world. Or my car is colored black, right? That's just describing. But that's one type of sentence. Another type of sentence is something that Austin calls performative sentence. So performative sentences basically create reality just by uttering that sentence. Okay? For example, and this is the sort of standard example that he provides, and many other philosophers provide when it comes to performative sentences. Think of a sentence as of the following that's pronounced by a judge before the marriage of two people. The judge says, "I now pronounce you man and wife." Okay, with that sentence, that judge is creating a reality. He is marrying the two people, right? It's changing the reality just by uttering the sentence, right? And Austin gives other examples like, when someone promises, and so on and so forth, okay? Now, not to get too deep into it, but you may think, what does a sentence have to do with behavior, right? Well, this is where Butler connects it to more postmodern ideas about the world, right? Basically, postmodern theories look at language in the widest sense of the word. They call it discourse, okay? And basically, a language is what creates reality, okay? A discourse creates reality. And think of discourse as the same thing as language, okay? So, therefore, you could see how performative discourse can create reality. And basically what Butler is saying is that, gender creates reality, as gender as a language creates reality. And let me remind you, language is basically, a reflection of reality. Okay, think of all our activity as language, in fact. Okay, it doesn't have to be spoken. Okay, very abstract, I understand, and maybe I'm not explaining it that well because it is abstract and very conceptual, but feel free to look into this concept of performativity in a deeper sense in your reading or on YouTube or what have you. Okay, so just to kind of wrap it up, this idea of gender performativity is the way a lot of academics look at gendered behavior today, whether it's ethnic studies or other fields, women's studies, sexuality, and all that stuff, right? It's looked at as performativity. And that's how we make the link between something that's created and something that has, however, very real consequences, just like race. Race is something we create, but has very real consequence. So that parallel should be evident to you, hopefully. Right? What are some other terms connected to gender? Well, gender binarism. This is as a result of performativity, where we tend to just draw a distinction between male and female, right? It ends up being just two separate genders, and it's hard for us to conceive of gender beyond that, and that's referred to as gender binarism, right? Binarism, only two. And another term I could have included is gender polarization, which is very much related to binarism. Patriarchy, many of you are familiar with this. This is domination by men. So here we're talking about the infusion of power relations, just like we talked about with race, right? You can't think of gender as just neutral expressions because it's infused with power relations to the point where one gender becomes dominant and will go a long way to protect its domination. Right? And then heteronormative, this is a result of gender binarism, where you take for granted that, and this, by the way, relates to sexuality. If you look at this, sex versus gender versus sexuality, as we discussed, sexuality deals with sexual preference, sexual orientation, and heterosexuality seems to be the dominant, right? Talking about power, dominant sort of bifurcation or binarism versus homosexuality, right? Homosexuality is the marginal one. So, in other words, heteronormative, the term here normative means, a norm, like what should be the case, right? So heteronormative suggests that, the heterosexual sort of framework is what should be standard, mainstream, and acceptable, right? As opposed to other ideas of sexuality, let alone gender. Okay, so all these ideas point towards not only power, but also construction. So it's this idea that gender is really something that's fixed, right? It's marked by fixity. Binarism, heteronormative, no, that's fixed. So they argue, right? Binarism, that's fixed. Now, this is largely related to our world today, especially in, quote, Western civilization, where we take for granted things like gender polarization, gender binarism, even though patriarchy has been under assault lately, right? Meaning in the last few decades, if not past century. Certainly heteronormative is the norm, right? But you'll be surprised the degree to which gender seen strictly as binarism, or even sexuality seen strictly as hetero, well, how that is conceived differently in other cultures and societies, especially those cultures that are sort of marginal from the Western world. Okay, like, for example, indigenous groups of people that are less affected by the Western world and Western civilization and Western commerce and capitalism and so forth. For example, here's some cases here. In parts of India, Pakistan, there's such a thing as the third gender, hijra, okay, where it really doesn't fall exclusively under male, female. Perhaps it's a combination of both, but it's not simply a combination of both. It stands on its own, okay? And in fact, if I recall correctly, I could be wrong, but I believe this is this one was actually recognized by India's Supreme Court as a sort of legal third gender. Okay, so look at that in India and Pakistan. It's hard for us in the Western world to think of gender beyond male, female, right? It's just strictly binarism. But here in India and Pakistan, they have a third gender that you know, they don't question as much as we would question it if we were to go there, right? Oh, that's just, you know, something that's marginal or an anomaly, we might say, right? Whereas someone in India would say, Hijra, what's, you know, it's just a third gender. You guys have two genders, we have three, right? And there's other examples. You may have heard of the Native American culture of having so-called two spirits, right? Where neither male or female, and the term was, you know, used in using the word spirit, right? Well, that's it for the slides, but there's others. Okay, I recall something in Mexico with the indigenous people there, and they have their own term for a third gender that they accept. You know, they don't even question it as something being an aberration. They just accept it as a third gender. Okay, so my whole point is, in case of gender, the fact that it's just goes beyond that dichotomy indicates the degree to which gender is actually fluid, and even sexuality, right? Some scholars argue that sexuality is actually more fluid, and it's because we are immersed in the world where heteronormativity pretty much reigns, right, supreme, that it's hard for us to look beyond that. But in fact, it's more fluid.